Faced with white Americans exploring their lands for wealth and expansion, Native Americans encountered prejudice and violence, which systematically destroyed their cultures. Time and time again, wronged by the U.S. government, many tribes had reluctantly succumbed to the will of the whites, but others took a stand. Among them, 3 Plains Indian groups: Lakota Sioux, Arapaho, and Northern Cheyenne. Steeped in strong beliefs and led by powerful leaders, these tribes banded together to encounter the U.S. Army in the monumental Battle of the Little Bighorn. In June 1876, the Sioux led the charge in one of the greatest successes executed by Native Americans. To this day, the Battle of the Little Bighorn is a potent reminder of the cruelty and reform put in place against the Native Americans by the U.S. government, who explored and forcefully encountered the natives within their lands. Following the buffalo, a main food source and of great religious significance, Lakota Sioux, a nomadic tribe, migrated to the Black Hills from the Great Lakes region during the time of the American Revolution. With Thomas Jefferson's 1803 Louisiana Purchase, settlers began moving west, believing it was their manifest destiny to expand from coast to coast. In 1830, Andrew Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act to grant unsettled lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. The next 3 decades brought uprisings known as the Indian Wars. In South Dakota, Red Cloud, a powerful leader of Lakota Indians, waged war on the Bozeman Trail against settlers and the army who had set up many forts in the tribe's territory. In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty was signed, stating that the Sioux people could stay on the Great Sioux Reservation in the sacred land of the Black Hills and continue hunting bison.
Government gave up the Bozeman Trail. The Indians were allowed to burn the forts. And to them it was a great victory, and that was a victory of Red Cloud's.
Though a tenuous peace was established, conflict loomed. 3 equally powerful figures participated in a fateful exchange. General George A. Custer of the U.S. Army, Sitting Bull, a Lakota Sioux leader, and Chief Crazy Horse, an Oglala Sioux. George Armstrong Custer was a revered and popular Civil War general who fought for the Union. After the Civil War, he was commissioned as a fighter assigned to the 7th Cavalry in the Indian Wars. Sitting Bull, known for his bravery, was born in 1831 on the Grand River in the Dakota Territory. A medicine man, he became a Lakota leader in 1868. Chief Crazy Horse was born in about 1840, also in the Dakota Territories. When gold was found in the Black Hills, thousands of miners and settlers flooded the territory. Sioux Indians noticed the illegal trespassing and thus attacked many settlers that had been raiding what they called home. Subsequently, the U.S. Army sent Custer and the 7th Cavalry out on a surveying expedition. The 7th Cavalry was a regiment of the Army created in 1866 for the specific purpose of fighting Indians in the West. The U.S. offered to buy the land, but the tribes refused since they believed the land could not be exchanged for money. In reaction, the Commission of Indian Affairs required all Sioux Indians to go to a reservation by January 31, 1876. There was no response from the Sioux, and in an act of defiance, more than 8,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho congregated near the Little Bighorn River in Montana, land that was not designated as a reservation, to perform the annual Sundance. During the ceremony, Sitting Bull received a vision of soldiers invading his village from the sky upside down on their horses. The chief predicted a victory for the gathered tribes. 3 forces were sent out to return the natives to the Great Sioux Reservation. Launched out of Fort Ellis, Fetterman and Abraham Lincoln, the 3rd Force, led by General Alfred Terry, included Custer's 7th Cavalry. As the soldiers moved toward the large encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne, Crazy Horse successfully attacked General Crook's regiment of soldiers from Fort Fetterman at Rosebud Creek on June 17th. Meanwhile, the Army created an attack plan. General Terry from Fort Lincoln and Colonel Gibbon from Fort Ellis were to attack from the north. Custer, under General Terry and his 7th Cavalry, were to attack from the east and south. This would cage the Lakota and Cheyenne in the valley so that escape would be impossible. Crow and Arikara scouts, enemies of the Lakota, were sent ahead by Custer to gather information on the Indian encampment. Under the cover of night, Custer positioned the 7th Cavalry in the Wolf Mountains, about 12 miles from the large camp of Lakota and Cheyenne. The scouts' intelligence revealed to Custer that the camp knew of the Army's presence. The planning to hold his attack until the 25th of June, once he received information from the scouts, Custer ordered an immediate attack on the tribes. Custer divided the 7th Cavalry's 12 companies into 4 sections.
So he had 4 different commands, all separate, and not within communication.
After Custer ordered Reno to attack the camp, Reno crossed the Little Bighorn and advanced downstream. When the camp was attacked by Reno's forces, the Indians were initially surprised, but their quick reaction caused Reno's troops to retreat. Warriors were able to shoot at the soldiers from close range, resulting in a quick but bloody battle with heavy casualties. Reno and his survivors made their retreat to High Bluffs, where they met up with Benteen and his segment. Custer had overlooked Reno's engagement with the Indians on top of the hill. He waved his hat in motivation for his comrades' troops and disappeared into the ravine of Medicine Tail Coulee. The warriors eased off of Reno's troops and began to go after Custer's column. The Indians immediately had the upper hand with nearly 2,000 warriors to only 225 cavalrymen. The soldiers were quickly overwhelmed and their horses were sent into a stampede, with the natives killing the remaining survivors of Custer's 7th Cavalry. The few soldiers who hadn't perished withdrew back to Reno's position and were held under siege by the warriors from June 25th to the early morning of June 26th. General Terry discovered the soldiers stripped and mutilated. Later that same day, the bodies were buried in a mass grave on the site of the battlefield. In the days following the battle, the Indian encampment scattered, several going back to reservations. The remaining Indians amounted to only about 600. General Crook and Terry remained in Montana, waiting to move against the remaining Lakota until they had reinforcements. The New York Times broke this story in an editorial on July 7th.
There was absolute shock because Custer was like a rock star.
At the same time, news from the Little Bighorn reached President Grant during the nation's centennial celebration in Philadelphia. Over the next several months, thousands of soldiers stormed the Black Hills, forcing many of the once great Indian chiefs to surrender to the army. Crazy Horse and his followers continued to elude the army and General Miles, who relentlessly chased them that winter. Crazy Horse surrendered on May 6, 1877. The same month, Sitting Bull led his Hunkpapa Sioux across the U.S. border into Canada. In September, Crazy Horse tried to leave the reservation unpermitted, and thus General Crook ordered his arrest. He did not resist. It was not until he was led to a guardhouse that he started to struggle, and he was then run through the back with a bayonet. 4 years later in Canada, with his people starving, Sitting Bull too admitted defeat and was sent to the Standing Rock Reservation. 5 years later, in 1890, the Ghost Dance came to Sitting Bull's reservation. The ceremony was supposed to empty the land of the whites and restore the old way of life. In other reservations, it had caught on as well, and officials feared Sitting Bull would join the effort. Lakota policemen were sent to arrest him. Early morning, December 15, 1890, they entered his cabin and dragged him outside. His followers, hearing the commotion, had gathered there, and in the gunfight that followed, Sitting Bull was shot in the head.
They lost a great leader.
After Sitting Bull's death at Wounded Knee Creek, roughly 350 Sioux and their chief Bigfoot were surrounded by the U.S. Armed Forces. On the morning of December 29th, the chief consulted with officers until a gun was fired. As warriors scrambled to grab their weapons, the army responded with gunfire in the camp. When the smoke cleared, 300 Sioux were dead, one of them being Bigfoot. The massacre ended the Ghost Dance movement and the end of the Indian Wars. In June 1948, construction started on the Crazy Horse Memorial in the Black Hills to honor the chief. The monument's construction is still ongoing today. Chief Henry Standing Bear, who prompted the idea for the monument, said, "My fellow chiefs and I would like the white man to know that the red man has great heroes also." In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that in 1877, Congress had taken the Black Hills illegally from the Sioux. The Sioux Nation was offered $1.3 billion, but they refused the money and continued to fight for their rights. In 1991, the name of the battle site was finally changed to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. Still, the U.S. government has failed to care for the tribes as promised. Across the country, Native Americans live in substandard conditions. The encounter at the Battle of Little Bighorn was the beginning of the end of the Sioux and Cheyenne traditional and nomadic way of life. Through the violent encounter between the military and Indians brought these once great tribes to their knees. The Battle of the Little Bighorn still symbolizes the cries of a determined people to fight for their values even when faced with the destruction of their culture. The cruel retaliation at the tragic incident at the Wounded Knee Ghost Dance Massacre of 1890 echoed far into the 20th century. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was a vicious encounter between whites and Indians that forced Native peoples to exchange their traditional values. Yet natives today continue to explore and regain their culture lost decades before.